the supernatural.
Download the Legacy Edition of Spirit Blade, a full past audio drama, for free at spiritblade.com.
Hey guys, I'm Paeter Frandsen from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions, joined today by games media personality Colin Moriarty, that you might recognize for his many years over at IGN. He co-founded Kind of Funny in 2015 and left and started Colin's Last Stand in 2017. You can get more information over at patreon.com/Colin's Last Stand, which is the biggest geek brand, I've heard him say recently, on Patreon. Colin is noteworthy throughout his career for thoughtful analysis of games and the games media, and in my estimation, known for his measured words and somewhat conservative political views when at least compared to his colleagues. Thank you very, very much, Colin, for making time to talk with me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm sorry that it took us so long to get this going, but I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I'm glad it worked out. And I also want to take the chance to just verbally, since I haven't been able to do this verbally in a long time, I want to verbally thank you for braving me in your home. It was just a few days, over 1 year ago, I realized recently that we made that recording of an episode of your podcast that's now been retired called Fireside Chats. I think the name of that episode was Questioning Faith. But anyway, thank you. That was a great experience for me.
Cool. No, I was happy to do it. We had, or I guess I should say I had a lot of great people over. You're one of the really memorable ones for me too. And we just kind of had to shut the show down because people were getting a little crazy out there. I never had a bad experience actually in person. We did 115 of them or something like that. But I never knew when someone was going to come over and stab me or something. So
well, I remember when I was coming into your apartment, I was just thinking to myself, this guy is extremely bold to be doing this, because I just kind of had an awareness, especially in that moment, of like, I'm coming into this man's home, and so for as long as you did it, that was a really bold, brave, I don't know if you want to call it experiment in podcasting or endeavor, but I'm really glad that you did it, and selfishly for the opportunity that I had. Okay, so, by the way, I want to mention, if anybody's interested in hearing that conversation, I'll put a link to that below. Should be visible easily wherever you find this conversation. But we're going to talk about something different completely. I want to talk about the idea of Christians in the games industry. And I'm going to set the table just a little bit here, and then I'll let Colin talk. But Christians in the games industry, either on the media side, media press side, or the publishing/development side. I've been asked by a number of Christians over the years since starting Christian Geek Central about, whether or not I thought that Christians should get into the games industry. And my answer's always been, well, yes, but I've never had any knowledge or experience to equip them in like how to potentially prepare for that, or what to expect heading into those fields. And so first off, I want to say there are Christians in the games industry making noteworthy titles, not just titles for the Christian market, but noteworthy titles for mainstream audiences. Tripwire Interactive, who makes the Killing Floor games, and Maneater is led by John Gibson, who openly shares his faith. And if you've played the Killing Floor games, you have been listening to Christian death metal probably without realizing it. Vertigo Games, who makes Arizona Sunshine, Skyworld, the upcoming Traffic Jams. Their focus is kind of in the world of VR games, but they're run by Christians. Soma Games, who does the Redwall series, is Christian-led. Cyan Incorporated, very well known for the Myst series of games, and more recently Obduction and the upcoming Firmament. Those are Christians running that. And then plus smaller notable games like Citizens of Earth and That Dragon Cancer, also created by Christians. It is harder to find Christian voices in bigger studios and the press media side of things. So the reason, Colin, I wanted to have you on was because of some comments that you made a few times in your work, especially since starting Colin's Last Stand, talking about the idea that, well, it'd be neat to see such and such an outlet hire this kind of person and this kind of person. You list several people coming from different perspectives and thought paths in life, and among those, at least once or twice, you mentioned an evangelical. And so I thought that was striking. And So I want to start by just asking, why is a diversity of thought and perspective in the games industry valuable, do you think?
Well, I think it's valuable for the reasons that you probably, really listed when you were mentioning those various studios that are run by or proliferate some sort of Christian thought, or at least live a Christian life. And it's important to note to your audience, like, I don't live a Christian life. Like, I don't consider myself Christian. I consider myself, as we talked on our show, I consider myself culturally Catholic.
Yeah.
But, which to a lot of Christians is, would be aghast at, I know there's issues with Catholicism. I have plenty of them as well. But I feel like we look at diversity, especially in these times, this kind of trying 2020 that we're in, diversity of skin color and diversity of nationality and gender or whatever, and that's all fine. I mean, that's good stuff. But I really feel like the most important level of diversity is in one's mind, because otherwise what you assume about like all black people or all Asian people or all white people, whatever the case might be, is that they're all the same. They have the same perspective because of their skin color. And that is so reductive and wrong, and it removes the agency of the individual. So I'm much more interested in what's in a person's mind than what color their skin is or what gender they identify as. And I just don't see, I've been in the games industry for 20 years, and I can name a couple Christians that I worked with, but their work wasn't Christian, if that makes any sense.
Sure, yeah.
So like Jared Petty, who I worked with at IGN, is a devout Christian, and he was actually a pastor or a preacher.
That's right.
And Steve Butts, who's a controversial figure now because he's been accused of a lot of bad stuff, I guess. But he used to bring up the Bible and scripture and stuff to me all the time. I mean, he worshipped. So I just feel like it would be cool to have people at outlets like IGN or GameSpot or Kotaku or whatever that wore that stuff on their sleeves, because we get so many of these perspectives, which I find somewhat vapid, of the far left social justice angle on everything. But we never really get an interesting perspective, or very few interesting perspectives, about how games are interpreted on the right. And I think Far Cry 5 is an interesting example. I really loved that game. I thought that game was awesome. The bad guys in it are kind of evangelical Christians in the David Koresh mold. They don't really go into it too much, but it's definitely like a right-wing militia type feel. And it would have been cool to get an interpretation of how that is from a person on the right who sees their own religion being bastardized in the game or whatever, while we were seeing all of this commentary on the game from the left. So it's not to say one is more valid than the other. It's just that I think like a cacophony of perspectives just adds texture to our conversations, and it makes things more interesting. I want that. It's really been a boon for me, because my perspective seems so unique, because I come from a more right-wing perspective, and I think that's relevant in analyzing art and in analyzing games and talking about our medium. But it's just surprising to me that there's not more people out there, because we also play games. People on the right also play games. Conservative play games. Republicans play games. Trump supporters play games. Christians play games. Jewish people play games. So like, why doesn't anyone try to talk to them? That's my whole thing.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, on a little side note, I have to mention, I love the Far Cry games, and it was uncanny how well they mimicked. They did their research in those radio stations of like their weird culty, Christian evangelical vibey music on the radio. It was really uncanny. I mean, it was the style was dated, to be sure. It reminded me more of like what I would have heard on the radio maybe in the 90s, but they really did their research. It was just in the actual beliefs of Christianity that they really took a turn, which probably they did to be safe. It's interesting that they'll sometimes be wanting to make comments on Christianity, almost like without really taking on Christianity itself. But you're right, we certainly don't get in those bigger outlets and bigger game studios these perspectives in storytelling that are coming from the more right perspective. Right wing or right side or conservative. I'm not a political person, so I mean, like I tend to be much more interested in the underlying worldviews and philosophies that motivate people to choose a particular political stance or party or something like that. So I'm not good with the lingo like you are.
Well, I just think I will say that we just reduce ourselves into these little buckets. It's just an easy way to categorize ourselves. I think you're right. Like, getting to the underlying philosophies and how we categorize ourselves and why we tend towards certain things is interesting. And also having a base knowledge of the world so that you can interpret what's happening. Because with Far Cry 5, it was really surprising to me how ignorant so many people were in the games media that didn't realize that was David Koresh. I mean, Look at him.
Oh,
Like,
yeah,
the first time I saw it, I was like, "This is David Koresh." No one even mentioned it, and it just showed me. I'm like, "You're just talking from such a limited perspective. You don't even have any historical knowledge of what Ubisoft is trying to mimic here. Look at his aviators, for God's sake. Like,
Yeah.
that, and study what they're trying to mimic here." So that's another problem I have too. Is just there's just a lot. It's always like the shortest path from A to B, as opposed to trying to be a little bit more intellectual, let's say.
Do you think part of that's an age thing? I mean, I do notice some faces at IGN and other outlets, Game Informer as well, that are getting older, that are aging, with the industry. And the average American gamer, I believe, the recent stats is 35 years old. But do you think part of that, like not remembering David Koresh, is like an age thing? Because I was in junior high when that happened, and I am older than a lot of the faces I see in games media.
Yeah, it's just like I barely remember all of the Waco stuff happening in real time. I was born in '84, so this was happening when I was in middle school, but I recognize that face. And at a media outlet, the idea is not to write in a silo, but to like have editors and bounce ideas off of people. And certainly someone should have known or could have known if you had just moved out of your own perspective and saw what they were trying to do. And I actually appreciate Ubisoft more than a lot of publishers because they do try to seem a little bit more fair. They do try to, like before the Assassin's Creed games, they put that little, I haven't played one in a long time, but they put that little statement about how the game is made by people of all faiths and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
It's a little more liberal in that sense, but I'm not saying that a right-wing perspective is vital in a vacuum. It's just vital as a foil to the prevailing narrative because there are other perspectives and there are other righteous and valid perspectives that are not portrayed. Like the makeup of an outlet like Kotaku or IGN is not indicative per capita of the makeup of video gamers. And that is my whole point. It's like, if I was running IGN, I would really want to go out of my way to get as many disparate voices as possible. Like, I would probably fire half of the staff, frankly, and go out and find people that can fill in all of these gaps. Get a transgender writer, get a Trump voter, get an evangelical, get a libertarian, and see what happens. Mix them all up, and then let the listeners and the readers decide. But we don't get that, which is a boon to independent outlets like ours. So.
Yeah, and I want to support that kind of statement too. I mean, like, as much as I obviously, would look at the Christian worldview and say this is vital for everyone to hear and to understand, when it comes to a conversation in a public space, I want to encourage an environment where everyone has a voice. And likewise, I think when we look at history and see Christianity being tied and being like this dominant force, when it got tied to politics and stuff, that's when Christianity itself became corrupted, when it started getting involved in the power structures of the government. And so I think that Christianity itself and the voices, the thinkers among Christians become sharper, become at their best when they are conversing in a space where everyone has a voice that they can listen to and consider and refine their own thinking in light of. So it is a very politically charged landscape. We just see that more and more. I think in some ways, as we record this, we're in the thick of coronavirus, and we recently had the death of George Floyd and other similar instances leading up to that that have really kind of, again, brought the Black Lives Matter movement, into more common awareness of people. So, and for a long time, just in general, it's been a politically charged landscape. I reached out to two prominent Christians in mainstream games media to have a conversation like this. One of them fell off. They had some stuff in their career that they just need to give priority to. The other, interestingly, declined out of concern for the effect it might have on their relationships with their coworkers. Now, that very well could have been, and likely was, at least in part, because I was an unknown quantity to them, and so they weren't sure that they could, what that experience was going to be like to talk to me, how trustworthy I would be in something like this, But I do think it also speaks to the reality that, like, it may be the case that Christians just don't feel free to kind of express their views because of where what their work climates are like. So I want to kind of get into your experience-based knowledge to kind of give us a sense of the landscape in the field of the games industry. Would you, I mean, I think you've already kind of said this, but would you say that definitely things are strongly left-leaning in both media and then also in development and publishing? Do you think that's the case in both of those spheres and to the same degree? What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think that they both are dominated by left-wing thought and ideologues, and it's unfortunate because I think that it does a disservice to the industry. First of all, because like when you think about publishing, you do make artistic and professional decisions based on your business, but it should be based on trying to cater your game to a certain audience. And I don't really understand what being a Christian, like being a Christian, for instance, or you go to church on Sunday or whatever, and you just live a normal life, like why you would feel so alienated by an industry that's supposed to be somewhat agnostic and passive in its delivery of products. And so I understand more the left-leaning part of media because they hire each other and it's a lot of op-editing and riffing like we're doing now, and that just kind of attracts like-minded people, which is unfortunate, but it's the case. But with publishing and development, it was always a little more interesting, the left-leaning nature they portray, especially because there are many right-leaning people working at these game developers, as you said. I know them. I've told a story in the past about at GDC probably 10 years ago when a dude that worked at Telltale pulled me aside and thanked me for speaking so openly about conservatism and kind of more right-leaning politics and being quote-unquote brave enough to do that because he could never peek his head out of the foxhole himself. And so there shouldn't be a fear to speak, but there is a fear to speak, and that's going back to what I said earlier about if you just have a more ideologically diverse group of people talking to an audience, it gives them the option to pick and choose who and what they believe, and you can do that on an outlet-by-outlet basis, and you can do that obviously on Patreon and with podcasts and YouTube where it's a lot easier to find like-minded people. But I just, from a business perspective, I own 2 businesses. I don't understand why you wouldn't want to have the broadest possible audience just from a monetization point of view. This ideological purity is making it so that conversation is stifled and even ideas are stifled. And I got to say, you can predict the outrage that games are going to elicit before they come out because that's how predictable it's become. It reminds me of Kingdom Come Deliverance with complaining about how there are no people of color in whatever it is, Bohemia in the 14th century.
Yeah, that was interesting.
You saw that coming a mile away, and the Last of Us stuff with having some gender representation and homosexuality displayed, which is perfectly fine with me. But, you could just predict what's going to be an outrage and then who's going to be outraged about what. And I feel like people just seek that stuff out as opposed to, like you said, getting to the underlying philosophies and having constructive conversations. And the games media that I left in 2014 to do my own thing is not the games media that exists today. It was much different. Like I never, as an open conservative, I had like Mitt Romney shirts on and like Ron Paul signs at my desk and Don't Tread on Me flags. Like I wasn't like something that I was hiding. I was one of IGN's most popular writers ever of all time. And I never felt threatened by the people there, never felt threatened by leadership, was never told not to say something. And when I left, it seems like that all collapsed. Like I was almost the last person buttressing this idea that there can be multiple voices. And I wouldn't even feel safe going back to IGN to like see people I know. Not that I'm going to get attacked, but it's going to be really uncomfortable. And I was told by a high-ranking person at IGN a couple of years ago when I asked to use their podcast studio just to record something with someone in San Francisco that I was basically not welcome there because the staff would be upset.
Wow.
And I don't even know what I did. That's the craziest thing is like I still don't really even know what I did. And but I just have kind of reserved. I've kind of retreated within myself. I stopped reaching out to PR, stopped talking to everyone. We don't need any of these people to do what we do. Like that's the beauty of it is I literally fucking don't, excuse my language, don't need.
That's right.
I don't need PR. I don't need the goodwill of the games industry. I don't need the goodwill of people that just want to tear you down, just want to have ideologically echo chamberish conversations.
Yeah.
You have a massive and growing audience. It speaks for itself. And you don't stumble into the biggest games media or games podcast Patreon by just putting out a shitty product with no diversity. Like I have, I think, a really solid series of podcasts with people that disagree with me. And I think that that's really important. I don't want to talk to myself. It's like when I turn on the TV to watch the news, I don't turn on Fox News because I probably will agree with a lot of what they're saying. I watch MSNBC almost exclusively when I turn on cable news because at least I can hear someone else
Yeah.
You know, I don't know what's so scary about that. It's weird. It's weird to me.
I want to touch on, before we get deeper into this stuff, it's obvious like what your experience was with the press and media side of things. Can you remind me, since I didn't know to say at the beginning, how many years were you at IGN, and what were your positions that you held there while you were there?
Sure. From 2002 to 2007, I was a freelancer. I interned in 2003 and 2004 over summers, like between college years. I was in college from 2002 to 2007. And then when I graduated college in 2007, they offered me a job. So I was an associate editor from 2007 to 2010. And then I was an editor from 2010 to 2012. And then I was a senior editor until I left at the end of 2014. So I climbed the ladder to near the top.
Okay.
And I would have never been editor-in-chief. I don't think they would have ever let me do that, because I would have really radically changed. Like I said, I really would have gone on a editorial purge and got rid of voices that I didn't feel were useful. And restructured it to be more ideologically sane. But there was nowhere for me to really go up above where I was. Maybe editor at large or something.
So you even saw, like, even though you said that the IGN of today is very different from the one that you worked at, you saw even at that time the way that things were leaning, and maybe saw in your head a direction things were going?
Yeah, so I remember, I never got pushback from people in positions of power. I wrote whatever I wanted. No one ever asked me not to write anything. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that I brought in traffic and people liked me. But I remember writing certain stories that were controversial within the staff. And I remember writing specifically a story about, I don't know if you remember, with Borderlands 2, during its preview cycle in 2011, 2012, one of the devs referred to this mode they had as girlfriend mode. Do you remember this?
Oh, gosh, yes, I do.
And it was seen as being, he was basically saying it's like a mode for a person that doesn't know how to play the game, and he called it girlfriend mode.
Yeah.
And this was seen as like a really gendered and sexist attack. And I wrote a piece being like, this dude is just talking. Like, he's not trying to insult anyone. It's really more about what his intention is. Do you really believe that this guy is intentionally trying to be sexist to the biggest gaming outlet in the world?
Yeah.
Or is he just speaking off the cuff and you're like trying to kind of destroy him for that? It's so quaint in hindsight. That guy would be finished today if he did something like that. But and so I wrote about it, and I remember, I won't say her name, but it was another woman in editorial that I actually got along with, took umbrage with it, and I was basically like, we can have that conversation, but it's just too bad. Like, I don't know what you want me to tell you. If you want, and I was like, write your own complimentary piece. And people used to do that sometimes with some of the things I wrote, where they wrote the other side of of whatever contentious issue I was tackling as an editorialist, and that was awesome. I loved that. It was awesome to see on IGN splash pages, like my editorial and Lucy O'Brien's editorial about the same topic from two different perspectives. You will never see that on IGN today. And I really thought that was so valuable. And
yeah,
maybe I'm outside of the loop now, but I love IGN. I'll always be proud to have worked there. I owe them my career, and I owe specifically Per Schneider and Chris Carl and some other guys my career. They gave me a shot when I was very young. Like I said, I was 17 when they found me. And they introduced me to the games industry, and I appreciate that. But the website seems like a husk of what it used to be. It's just a lot of monetized videos and strategy guides and stuff like that. And I'm like, this is not recognizable as a valuable media outlet to me anymore, which is why I think people are fleeing and going to independent sources, whether it's Giant Bomb or whether it's Easy Allies or Kind of Funny or whatever.
Yeah.
These are frankly just better outlets putting out better products than these multi-million-dollar conglomerates that can't seem to shoot straight. And I think that sucks for us. That's the ultimate thing, is that those people are still the gatekeepers. We still haven't eroded perfectly the gatekeeping between media, which gets access, and everyone else that doesn't. And that's a big part of the problem. So they're able to set narratives as well, just like we saw they set the narrative with Catherine, just like we saw they set the narrative with Dragon's Crown, and with all these other games, like before anyone else even got their hands on it, because that access does matter. That's why this issue matters, is you want people like me or you or others to get access to this stuff. I mean, not me specifically, but you want people like us to get access too, so that we can also begin to wrap our minds around the issues of the games and provide a counterbalance so that we can have valuable debate as opposed to stifling things. And that's my big problem, is that I don't understand what everyone's so afraid of. If your ideas are so good and your ideas are so sound and righteous, then you would have no problem railroading me in written form or on a podcast. But instead you pretend that I don't exist, or you pretend that the idea doesn't exist. And that to me just shows a vulnerability in your own philosophy. I would never expose myself like that.
I want to come back to just kind of like just generally speaking. We don't need to get into specifics. I do want to talk about kind of like the effects of your views and expressing your views with your relationships with coworkers. But before I forget, I want to touch on what would be the basis for your kind of read that you have on the leanings and the climates, in terms of philosophy or politics, on the developer-publisher side, because your work has been working in press and media. How would you describe generally some of the connections that you've had that have given you insight to the game dev, game publishing side?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very similar left-leaning field, but I feel like there's just a lot more maturity with a lot of publishers and large developers where they're not stunted man-children like we were at IGN for a long time, and I was one of those people. It's not an insult. I mean, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was in my 20s, and I feel like at publishers and developers, these are just much more cohesive and cogent organizations that have an ideology that will support Pride Month or support Black Lives Matter or whatever, and that's fine. But there's definitely more of a diverse array of people that are working on these games, and as you said, every big game I can think of out of Sony studios, for instance, definitely have right-leaning people working on them. They're just really not afraid of, or they're afraid of making themselves known. And that goes back to the story I told the GDC with the Telltale guy. That's what sucks, and that's why it made me feel so important to speak up, because I wanted to at least give people some clarity that like we do exist, and
yeah,
it sucks to feel afraid and unwelcome at places, and especially with people that just didn't do anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with believing in small government or low taxation. There's nothing wrong with believing in Jesus Christ or whatever the case might be. And you see this shine through a little bit more at more professional organizations, but even they're being torn to the left and they're being torn asunder and within. And you see that a lot with some tech companies like Google and Twitter that have had this fight really vocally and loudly. So I feel like there's still an ideological sameness at these places, but Silicon Valley is not. I think there's a little bit of confusion because Silicon Valley is traditionally not really left wing; it's libertarian, and at some point it became. It kind of changed a little bit. Like these guys are filthy rich. They don't want the government involved in their tech. They don't want the government. You know what I mean? Like they don't want. Facebook doesn't want the government telling it what to do. Twitter doesn't want that. Apple doesn't want that. Apple refused to open the San Bernardino terrorists' phone for the FBI. They don't want any. So they have this libertarian streak in them. It's just that it's got to be drawn out by more fair representation of what we actually all believe and what we think is right. And that's the ironic part about everything, is that I think that most people want the same stuff and believe the same things. It's just that we've isolated like X, Y, and Z as these really divisive or pseudo-divisive issues that keep us apart, like life or what used to be like gay marriage or something like that. And it's like, yeah, these are important issues and I want to talk about them, but let's not pretend that there's not another interpretation to the pro-life movement. Let's not pretend that there's not another interpretation to belief and all of that. So I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit. But.
No, that's all right. And just so people know that you're not just kind of speculating from afar, your awareness of kind of your read on what's going on in the games industry and the climate there, that's based on what, friendships you have with developers or just interviews over a number of years?
Yeah, I mean, I would talk to... I didn't have many on-the-record interviews about these particular issues, but I know a lot of people, and people talk to me on background or just as friends, and they know that I use that information to inform myself, and sometimes I'll refer to what they've told me, and yeah, I mean, you have these conversations with people. There's a lot of fear, but there's, I got to say that, to be fair, there's also quite a bit of fear with left-leaning people that aren't fucking crazy, which is most people on the left. They're not crazy. They're totally normal people. They're totally scared of their flank. And I hear that a lot too. Like people don't want to speak out. I went out with a prominent developer for lunch. We're buddies, last year, and he was afraid of putting a selfie up of us on Twitter because of how he would be attacked for it, even though he's through and through left wing. And to me, I'm like, this has gotten to a really sad point. Yeah. I don't want to live like this. And so, yeah, people are just a little bit afraid, and I don't blame them. I mean, not everyone has their own corporate power like I do, where I make good money and I own my own companies and I do what I do, and so I have this voice. It's why I feel like J.K. Rowling has the ability to say whatever she wants about how she feels about feminism and transgender communities and all that kind of stuff. It's not to say she's right or wrong. That's up to the person. But she has such fuck you money at this point that she can say and do whatever she wants. Now, I'm not J.K. Rowling, but I'm in a position where I feel like people expect me to say what I feel. That's part of my brand, and I'm inoculated from the realities of working at a corporation where I would have to go into HR, and maybe there would be a complaint against me because I said that I was pro-life or whatever the example is, and all of this. I don't have to worry about that because I'm the boss. So it's actually a really nice position to be in. I understand most people are not in it.
So I do want to touch on that. You said that you felt the freedom to, during your time at IGN, and I would assume at Kind of Funny, I saw it at Kind of Funny. You know, you had freedom to express a very different viewpoint that was not part of the mainstream of those working in those places. But what effect, if any, did your unpopular views have, and expressing those views, either in your work or, in the break room or whatever, what effect did that have, if any, on your interactions or relationships with coworkers during all of your years before Colin's Last Stand?
Yeah, it's hard to say because there's such vitriol against me from people that I once called friends, and I don't know what the provenance of their hatred is, because when I left IGN, I was cool until at the end of 2014. I was cool with everyone. And I was cool with everyone through 2016. It was really Donald Trump's election, who I didn't even vote for, but it was really Donald Trump's election that made, as we saw, the world just turn upside down. The video game industry was not immune to that effect. And so I think that people started really drawing harsh lines in the sand at that time, and I really didn't want to. I don't know if you remember some Game Over Greggy Show episodes we did leading up to the election where I was trying to tell people, I thought Clinton was going to win, but I was trying to tell people, I'm like, you're misinterpreting this movement and you're misinterpreting these people and why they're voting and why they feel a certain way. I still feel that way 4 years later about Trump voters. I know many Trump voters. They're not the way that they're represented in mainstream media. That's not who they are. And they're not racist. They're not bigots. They don't hate anyone. They just want small government. They want to change and all that kind of stuff. And I respect and appreciate that. I especially respected and appreciated it before he was even elected, because we didn't really know, I think, the bad president he would become. I feel like some of that was wished into existence. But I feel like I wanted to just represent. Like I said, there are other people playing games. My content is for everyone. I don't want to make anyone feel like they're alienated from my content or isolated from me. I want to treat everyone with respect. And I feel like by whittling down your audiences, you're just making a huge mistake. And that's why I feel like I was valuable at IGN, and especially at Kind of Funny, and why I think Kind of Funny was probably at its biggest when I was there and broadest, was because we could bring in more people to have more rational and sane conversations as opposed to an echo chamber. And that's why when I went out and tried to find people to work with for Colin's Last Stand, I went after people like Chris Raygun, because Chris is not only a bleeding blue liberal and a Hispanic man, but a comedian. He's younger than me. He plays different games. He brings all different perspectives. It was very vital for me to find someone like that. And I just don't think people operate on that level, which is confusing, because by having Chris on board and not a carbon copy Colin Moriarty, we get more people to listen to the show. It's just, at the very least, at the very most reductive stance, it is smart business.
Yeah.
But apart from that, it's just good content. And yeah. So
did you feel like? I mean, there was. We're not going to get into the whole thing with the tweet that you put out that kind of led to starting Colin's Last Stand. But I mean, prior to that, did you feel like you had to just steer clear of certain people while you were at work because of? I mean, how did it feel like to work in that environment, having the views that you have?
It was at IGN, it wasn't quite getting crazy yet. Like, I left IGN at the end of Gamergate and all that, or at the beginning of Gamergate was the end of my time at IGN, so I didn't feel too much pressure there. I was also like not even 30 years old by the time I left, so I didn't have a lot of insight into how things would later become. At Kind of Funny, I owned 20% of the company, and I was free to say whatever I wanted, but I would get talked to sometimes about the things I was saying on shows and how they were divisive or making people uncomfortable or whatever, but I can never really identify exactly why some of these things would make people uncomfortable. But it became clear after Trump was elected in November 2016 that things were going to come to a head. I had never intended on staying at Kind of Funny forever. It was never my forever company. It was turning into a company that I didn't really recognize internally, and I certainly don't recognize now. It's just not the company that I wanted. CLS is more the company that I wanted, and so I made it myself. But I feel like there was a target painted on my back at that point because the games media blob and this horde needed someone. And since they created some sort of ideological purity amongst themselves, really, they needed still to purge. I mean, you're seeing that still today. You're seeing all sorts of random people getting thrown together as if all of them are evil and bad. And we talked about this on Sacred Symbols, where I'm like, there's a big difference between misspeaking about someone or using the wrong pronoun or whatever, or telling a bad joke, and like sexually assaulting someone. Those are like echelons apart, and inside of those echelons are more echelons, and we can't just categorize all of them. It really hurts me when my own name is brought up as in this other group of people because I told a joke on Twitter, and you know, so I even saw people call me like an abuser and stuff, and I'm like, that's fucked up. That's not true at all. You know, like, I've never hurt anyone in my life, and you'll never find anyone that would say otherwise. And so I feel like at some point when Trump was elected and there was a lot of anger and vitriol, that the target got painted on my back, because while I wasn't a Trump voter, I was two other things. I was closest in proximity to a Trump voter that they had around them, and I was the only person speaking out for Trump voters. And so the game was up at that point. I just didn't really realize it yet. And so as we moved into 2017, I left in March of 2017, but as we moved into 2017, things got really tense. And it was clear that it was untenable. And I didn't know, in hindsight, it makes so much sense how it broke down, because now it's 2020, it's more than 3 years later, and we've seen so much chaos that it's very quaint what happened to me in some way, but it was the beginning, amongst other things, of what was the trends that were going to happen. And the only thing I'll say is that I made a really smart move, because not only did I make the smart financial move and all of that, which is awesome, but I made the smart move to not back down and not apologize and not capitulate, because I reiterate again, I did nothing wrong. And if people just held their ground, then apologies would mean more when they're said, because then you know people really mean them, as opposed to saying them in self-preservation or whatever. So I refused to do that. First of all, no one was really offended by what I said. I said that at the time. I say that now. No one was actually offended. This was all a political game, and not capitulating was I'm so proud of myself for standing my ground, because it was really tough. It was emotional. I lost a whole lot in doing that. I lost most of my friends and all of this, but I was like, I really didn't do anything, and I'm not going to apologize about it. I'm sorry that people are hurt, but I'm not sorry about what I said. It was a Al Bundy joke.
Yeah, and, we have to quote it now. We've gotten this deep into it. Can you just quote the tweet really quick?
Yeah, all I said, it was like International Women's Day or whatever, Day Without a Woman, and I just said, peace and quiet. Yeah. That was literally it. And it was about my girlfriend at the time. We're not together anymore, but she was a talker, and I was just making fun of her. And that was it. I mean, I didn't even think about it. I remember writing the tweet. I remember laying in bed. I remember that day so well. Yeah. And it's so weird, because I remember kind of sauntering into work. I used to take Ubers to work when I lived in San Francisco. And I remember just walking in, getting ready to do the morning show, and like everyone was really mad, and we had to have like a conversation. And I'm like, what are you guys talking about? I didn't even think twice about it. I'm like, I've said way more offensive shit than this. Yeah. And that was the beginning of the unraveling. Then the guys went to PAX. I decided that weekend to quit, and on Monday I quit. The next Monday I founded CLS. So it all happened within like 2 weeks or so of each other. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and that does give an idea of the climate. So I guess it's not a bad idea that we brought it up, because of the sensitivity there. I mean, like, the most I would say about that comment is you could say it's an unwise comment if you want to avoid offending people, you know. But I would agree with you that the comment itself, especially given the spirit that it's in, there's nothing wrong with the comment itself. At the most, I would say unwise. But the way people reacted to it was really I don't want to say shocking, because at that point, just watching the trends as much as I had been, I wasn't shocked by it. But yeah, it was really disappointing, really disappointing.
Yeah, I want to say real quick, I do agree with you. It probably was unwise, but I'm not going to walk around on eggshells. I I consider myself somewhat of a comedian. Like I want to be silly. I want to make people laugh. I want to be inappropriate. I want to challenge. And if people take offense to that, like that's fine, but that's not going to stop me from doing what I do. And I think for the 5th year anniversary of CLS, so that would be in 2022, I do want to do like a really comprehensive look back at that whole event, because I've never really sat down and like thought about it and went through the responses and what people were saying. I've never really sat down and looked back. And I think it would be really interesting to kind of expose it as such a farce that was like in the prologue of this novel that we're in now, this dysfunctional dystopian novel that we're in now. And so, yeah, I'd like to take a look back at it. But I agree with you. I agree with your assessment. It was unwise. It cratered. Well, I don't want to say cratered. I'm doing better than ever, I guess. It potentially cratered my entire career. It is so silly. And it was my response to it that I'm really proud of doing that and keeping my head, because it would have been really easy to get scared at that moment. And it was uncomfortable, but I knew I needed to press forward.
Well, speaking of pressing forward, I want to get to some other stuff before time gets away from us. I want to do a little speculation game right now. I'm going to talk about a hypothetical Christian and who has some controversial positions. And once I'm finished giving you the description, I'm going to ask you just some things about how you think that person would do in the games media. So here's our hypothetical Christian. And there are many different kinds of Christians with many different kinds of views. This is just one. There are also controversial positions that someone could have on violence or the occult in games and stuff. I'm going to set those aside for now, because I think these that I'm going to mention are the more hot button issues. Okay, so let's say you've got an evangelical Christian who believes that female nudity and tightly or barely clad attractive character models in games are a form of female objectification. It doesn't matter if you agree with that or not. That's their position. The second position they have, and would be the really hot button one, would be that same-sex attraction, while natural for some, is not God's intention for us, in the same way that say someone who is driven to drink alcohol that we would say has alcoholism, that's natural, it feels natural for them, but it's not God's desire for them to pursue. So in other words, this person does not have an attitude of hate or disgust toward those who have same-sex attraction, but rather, if anything, feels sympathy. They're not going around with like a, oh, I'm so sorry for you kind of attitude. You know, they're probably not even talking about it. In fact, what I would say about this Christian is they don't talk about these views at work unless it becomes relevant to their assignment or they're asked about their view by a coworker. They may express their views from time to time on social media accounts not officially connected to their work, but that would be the most of it. So, given that description, what should this person expect if they're working? First, we'll start with the games media side. If they're working for a large games media outlet, what do you think this person should expect?
It's funny, the two issues you brought up, because I think one of the issues would be really salient with left-wing media.
Yes.
And one issue would be not salient at all with left-wing media. So the female objectification thing, I think, is a pretty relevant and prevalent conversation in the industry. If you think about the evolution of Lara Croft, for instance, from the original Tomb Raider in 96 to the Crystal Dynamics Tomb Raider games, she's really changed. She's really still attractive. She's still buxom, kind of, but she doesn't have massive boobs and ridiculous objectification. And I remember, and I'm sure you do too, like even some of the ads that we used to get for games were pretty crazy. I remember, and some of them were pretty tame too, but I remember like the Gex Enter the Gecko ad for PS1 with like a beautiful woman in like a little dress and all these kinds of things. So female objectification has long been contentious, and I'm actually sympathetic to this, because I just think that women should be represented in a way that makes the most sense for their character. So in other words, we shouldn't reduce a woman to just her breasts or her ass or whatever, like some of these other games did. But rather, if that's relevant, if it's relevant for her to have her boobs hanging out of her shirt, then do that. But otherwise, make it so that she's a character that is relatable to someone. So I think that this particular hypothetical person with the female objectification would probably find quite a few allies, even though they're coming from it at different perspectives. And by the way, this is why I think it's so important to get down to philosophies, like you said, because there is so much crossover. The Venn diagrams are really dynamic, and I think that this shows that. So speaking out about that, so that your character doesn't look like Bayonetta or something like that, is, I think, really relevant unless I think there's a place for those kinds of games, and I think that's fine if you feel like your game demands it, but I think those conversations should be had. The same-sex attraction thing is not going to go over well. And now, that's not a point of view I agree with either.
Sure.
But I know there are purists that believe, if you want to call them that believe, same-sex attraction is X, Y, or Z, or marriage is between one man and one woman. It's not something I agree with, but I understand that those viewpoints are out there. I don't think you're going to find that view very prevalent because, like I said, even if you go down to the libertarian roots of the industry and the libertarian roots of tech, libertarianism still suggests that this is perfectly fine. That's how I draw my social conclusions too. So you're not going to find any Venn diagram crossover there because that is, I guess, too far right. You're not going to find the support of many right-wing social issues anywhere in the industry. But I think that you probably should, in some respects, not necessarily with these issues, but like I've always been really compelled by the pro-life conversation and the issue around life. I think that there's a righteous other side to that coin, and so I don't think you can really hate on someone for being pro-life. But for same-sex attraction, I mean that seems to me, the person you described there, it seems like an archaic point of view from my perspective, but certainly from the perspective of a monotypical industry like the gaming industry. That's probably something best kept to yourself. And it reminds me a little bit. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you think that person could keep their job if as I described them, it only becomes relevant when it's relevant to their assignment, or someone asks them about their view, and other than that, they're not like parading and crusading on social media, but maybe they'll just post something, once that expresses that view. Are they going to be able to, let's say, keep their job?
I would assume so, just because I feel like that's an equal protection issue, and I feel like if a Naughty Dog, just as an example, had a person that came out and said that they're against gay marriage or whatever, and they fired them, I don't know that that's legal. I don't know that that's illegal as long as it wasn't coming into the workplace. Like, I would assume if someone at Naughty Dog was like, I don't want to work on any scenes with Ellie because she's a lesbian, that's a pretty radical thing to say. Yeah. And I think that's really unfounded and unfair to the team, unfair to lesbians and everything else. But I don't know that if someone earnestly went and said, I'm uncomfortable with this, I don't want to work on this, can I work on something else, like some other part of the game, some other component of the game, and they refused and they fired you, I don't know that that's legal. I would have to look into it because you wouldn't, I don't know, I guess they're not really the same. I was going to say you wouldn't be able to fire someone, nor should you, if they came out as gay. That's definitely illegal. I don't know where political or philosophical viewpoints kind of begin and end, and the argument that other people might feel uncomfortable and all of that kind of stuff. But I do feel like it reminds me again of what I was saying earlier of J.K. Rowling, where I think Hatch is her, or Hatchette or something, or whatever it's called, is her publisher. And there were people there, because she's working on a new anthology of children's books or whatever, that were saying, like, we don't want to work on J.K. Rowling's books anymore because of her viewpoints on transgender people. And they were like, too fucking bad. Like, this is J.K. Rowling. Like, first of all, we're going to work on. So there should be maybe that conversation, and maybe it would be okay for the hypothetical developer to tell this hypothetical person, like, okay, you're entitled to your viewpoints. They're rooted in biblical interpretation or philosophy or whatever the case might be. That's fine, but it cannot affect your work. And we need you to work on Ellie or whatever. So. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm fascinated by the two points you brought up, because I think that you will find unanimous support for, even though it might come from a right wing or Christian viewpoint, and the other. I don't know
if I buy that though, because what I'm talking about is someone who would say, like, maybe what I'm meant to describe is something that's a little bit more severe, where they're like, any time that you're putting a character model that is physically fit and lean and meant to look attractive, anytime you put them in really tight-fitting clothing, or anytime you show nudity that's of a physical body that's not the kind you would run into from a random person in the grocery store. Because you think about the physical bodies of characters in comic books and video games, there's very little variety compared to the body types you find walking through the grocery store, and so this person would maybe say that there's a sexualization or an objectification going on there. Now maybe that's because it's easier to just keep to one kind of character model or not, but nevertheless, that would be more the view I'm talking about. And so I'm wondering if this person would still have trouble, because even the left-leaning folks who say that certain things are objectification would say of other things, no, that's not objectification, but this hypothetical person would.
Yeah,
I don't know. Do you find variations in that?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I think that I personally, my personal opinion on this is that I find if you have a character like in Dead or Alive, Volleyball, or you have or Bayonetta or something, and people find that objectification of women, I'm like, yeah, I can see that. I don't know that it's necessarily not playing into what the game is, and games can be campy and weird and sexual and all of that. But I think that certain things have changed in the industry with the representation of women because people did take issue with the more base and maybe inappropriate representation of women going back to the past. So that if there's not context for those representations, then there's a problem. So I think that like complaining about Lara Croft having a tight tank top on or whatever is really not a valid complaint. But I also don't know that, well, maybe it's a valid complaint to the person making it, but I don't know that the dev would have any sympathy for it. Yeah. Because like I said earlier when I was saying that there's like all of these echelons and degrees between different egregious acts and that they shouldn't all be necessarily treated the same. I feel like the same thing can be said for almost anything, and that would be about the representation of women too. Women have bodies; they wear tight clothes. It's like this is the way it goes. This is like when I look at Lara Croft in the Crystal Dynamic games, I'm like, this looks like a real woman to me. This looks like, or I look at Elena in Uncharted or whatever, Ellie in The Last of Us. I'm like, these look like real women. This is real. They might be attractive. They might be wearing tight clothes, but this is the way. It's not like her tits are hanging out or anything like that. And I understand if someone would have a problem with that. I think that the one, it's funny, man. The one thing that I think that the Christian right and the far left share with each other more than anything is prudishness. And I find that like most people in the middle don't really care about this stuff. I've actually talked on my shows about how I find sex scenes in most things are like totally unnecessary. I actually hate them. Yeah. And not because I don't. First of all, I don't want to watch someone have sex in a movie. It's nice if like you see them making love and then the camera pans up and we go to the next scene because it's important. I mean, that's a relevant part of storytelling.
Yeah, we know what happened. We know they had this really intimate connection. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. But we don't need to see it. I don't need to. And we see that a little bit in The Last of Us Part 2. There's a pretty uncomfortable scene there for me. But I understand that that's just my opinion, and that sometimes that stuff playing out is really important to the storytelling, and it's a motive for people. And so I just think that like we have to identify what is offensive and what isn't, and why you're offended or why you're not. So with this hypothetical person worrying about tight-fitting clothes on a fit woman, I mean that's not going to fly. I mean that's not even. I don't think that's even a reasonable complaint, which is so funny because objectification of women in a more base way is a valid complaint. And obviously the same-sex marriage thing or not marriage, but the same-sex attraction thing is definitely not going to fly. And an opinion that I personally think is wrong. That the question is, and I'm thinking about it as a business owner with employees, is like if someone came up to me and said that about, I know that all I just know the people that work for me, and I know they don't feel like this, but if someone did say that and I didn't know and it didn't affect their work, how would I feel? Because I do feel like that's not really. I don't know. I don't agree with that philosophy. Is it relevant to our work? I don't know. I've never been met with that situation. So who knows how I would react to that as well. I also think, by the way, you have to take into mind, like if that spreads around a studio of 100 people through whatever, and there are same-sex people there, then they're naturally going to feel less than. I don't think that wouldn't be a huge surprise at that point. You got to kind of we are allowed to put our philosophies out there. We also have to take responsibility for how they might affect others.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so one thing that is going to be a high value among a number of Christians is responsibility to family, assuming that they're married and or have kids, and also serving at their church maybe once or twice a week, maybe on the weekend or on one weeknight each week. So I've heard you talk about how some of these big games, like the ones that Rockstar puts out, they just aren't made by people that are working 9-to-5 jobs, you know. And so I want to give realistic expectations. Do you think that there is a job, or there are commonly jobs in either the press media side of things or the games development side of things where someone can work a 9-to-5 job and still advance or at least maintain a career in those fields?
Yeah, I think with media, because they're starting to unionize a little bit more and protect themselves a little bit more, for better or for worse, I think you could probably get away with having a better life-work balance there. The thing about being a journalist or writing or being a critic is that it's hard to contain that work and the excitement about that work within a 9-to-5. So I think that you could advantageously work more than 8 hours a day, but do it more at your leisure. I think what a lot of websites right now are figuring out, working remotely because of coronavirus, is that they don't really need to be together at all. And if you have an embargo that you have to hit at 12:01 a.m. on day X, and you have the game 7 days early, then it really doesn't matter if you're playing it at 9-to-5. You know, like, play it whenever you want, as long as you get the work done. That's the whole mantra and modus operandi of CLS. It's like, as long as we hit deadlines, I don't care when you work. As long as we get our shows up on time. So I think it would be a little bit more reasonable to work on the media side, especially because a lot of that work's done in silos, independent from one another. On the game dev side, I think you would be much harder pressed. You hear stories like during the Rockstar fiasco with Red Dead, you would hear like a guy like, I'm a sound engineer at Rockstar. My first game at Rockstar was Grand Theft Auto 3. I've never worked more than 40 hours a week. And there he is. He's still there. So it's like those people exist, but I don't think you're going to be able to climb working that way. And I also think that game dev doesn't typically attract people that expect to work within strict parameters anyway. If you, I've heard this from so many people, like, you know, an environment artist who's working on, you know, a tree or whatever one night, and he's modeling it, and 5 o'clock happens and he's got to roll home, but the tree's just not right, and he could ship it the way it is and insert it into the game and create a new build for everyone and all of that, but he really wants to get that tree modeled properly, so he stays until 8 or 9 because that's what he wants to do. That's the drive of art. It's not, there's nothing wrong with working within parameters of 9-to-5 or whatever, or having strict life-work balance or punching a clock. That's all valuable, and that's interesting that people prioritize different things. I worked as a landscaper where in college, where we would punch in and out on a machine, and I remember people like lining up and waiting for it to turn to 5 and then punching their, like, going into a line and punching their cards, and that's fine. These guys, this is the life they live. They worked hard. They want to go home. But for me, I would often lose track of. I do often lose track of time as I'm working, and I just feel like in the creative fields, and I know you can relate to this as a creative person and a content creator yourself, like, it's really hard to say, like, let's put it this way. I have never, ever, and I make these things in my mind all the time, I have never approached something and been like, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to get it done today, and it's going to be done within these hours. It never happens. It never happens. I always get distracted. More things occur. I have to put a fire out. Complications rise up. Other things arise that need to be taken care of. And so I think going into game dev, if you want to be a force within game dev and be valuable, then you have to understand that these games are not made in 40-hour work weeks. And we were actually on Sacred Symbols that just went up today. We're criticizing Tencent, the Chinese conglomerate, is creating a California-based studio to make a AAA PS5 game. And one of the things that they're putting out and hiring people is that we're going to have like a crunch-free structured environment or whatever. And I'm like, your game's going to suck. If you really think that you are all going to come in here and work 40-hour weeks on this game, it's never going to get done. You can't do that. I'm not saying that you have to work 100-hour weeks, but people put their lives and their passion into this. And by the way, it's important to remember, you only get to put out a game if you're a developer every 3, 4, 5 years, sometimes more. If you think about Amy Hennig, she hasn't put out a game since 2011. And you don't get that many chances to do it. You want to get it right. Your name's in the credits. You want to have your portfolio support what you did in this great game. And so I think that even if you go into the situation with the intention of working 9-to-5, you're going to realize either through peer pressure or the pressure of the product or the advancement of your career that you're going to break from that. But I think that if you want to serve at church on a weekday, or you want to go on Sundays or something and go to service or whatever you want to do, help children's groups, whatever the case might be, I think you can find time with that. I think you just have to work around the parameters of your job and understand also that there are ebbs and flows. Like, no one in Naughty Dog is really even working right now. You know, so now you would have all the time in the world to do whatever you wanted before they come back to make the next game. So I think you have to just go into it understanding that it's just a little bit different. It requires a little bit more out of people. I think it's a lot like making a film, writing a book. But in the film industry, there's incredible money to be made by working long hours, and everyone's unionized and everything like that. And the games industry isn't there and might not never ever get there. So you have to also understand that you're working basically for a promised salary and bonuses, and sometimes very rich bonuses. People lost track of the fact that at Rockstar for Red Dead Redemption, some people were getting 6-digit bonuses for that game. You know, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
If you look back and said, I crunched for the last year of this game, but I got a $150,000 check in addition to my 6-figure salary, I think you'd probably be pretty smitten. So those are all the things that you kind of have to balance out if you're someone looking to get in. I don't think you're going to find a hard time doing what you need to do. I just think you're going to have to kind of work around what's expected of you.
Okay. So you mentioned that, you didn't think you would ever have gotten to like editor-in-chief over at IGN because just of the nature of the climate. So I'm curious, what I think it's going to have to be a different climate in order for, someone to be in that kind of position that has more middle or conservative-leaning views. I'm curious what you think, what kind of changes need to happen in the games industry in order for a diversity of thought to be valued, and then how do you think that change could potentially be brought about?
I think these are kind of can be answered in the same way, because I think change will come when someone is hired in a position that can proliferate different viewpoints, and then people realize the inevitable, which is this is pretty tame, and people vibe with this, and it creates a conversation around our content. It's going to be good for traffic. It's going to be good for the bottom line. It's going to be good for attracting new audiences and ideological diversity. And so I think that if anyone has the boldness to break that barrier down and do what I said, which is to hire an evangelical, hire someone that writes from the perspective of a Trump voter or a red state Republican or whatever, and just see how it goes, then I think more people will be brave, and that could open the floodgates for people to come out and say what they need to say, and competitors see that this is working for outlet X, so now they want to get in on the game. And I think that's how you break down the walls. But I just understand that is sadly not going to happen. And I think that it would be. It's so funny because me getting hired, it would be impossible today. Like, it would never happen. And it's so funny because I was one of IGN's most valuable employees for many years, and it seems like the eras have just flipped and changed so much. And I wasn't valuable because I was more talented than anyone, or I wrote better necessarily or anything like that. It's because I just sounded different. That's the thing that I think people just don't get. It's like sound different than all of this prevailing stuff, and that's why I think if and when these websites kind of go kaput or reduce their staffs or whatever, a lot of these very snarky, very rude and mean and ideologically pure people at these outlets have no prayer of creating something on their own, because they have created such a hostility with many people that support them. They only support each other. But you find that a lot of the audience doesn't support this stuff, and sometimes it could be looked at as piling on, but sometimes you have to look at it for what it is, which is that, like, people really don't like what you have to say. And I think that just comes from hearing the same thing over and over again. How much can you be hit over the head with the same tired arguments with no counter or counter-prevailing argument that might present that this isn't the way it seems? And that's why I feel like these outlets churn content and churn traffic through SEO and through sale links and easy low-hanging fruit, but they're not saying anything important or relevant anymore. And I know that because I read all these sites once a week, every week in detail when I'm making Sacred Symbols. I read IGN in detail. I read Kotaku in detail. I spend hours and hours every week doing that. And I'm telling you, these sites suck. You know, like, it's sad to say, but, like, I love some of the people that work at IGN. They're doing the best they can, but, like, who is this content for? What is this? And that's a big problem. So I think that if someone was just brave enough, the smartest thing an IGN can do is hire someone like me. The smartest thing IGN can do is hire an editor-in-chief like me that would shake things up and allow everyone to have a voice. But that's not going to happen. And so that's at their own detriment. And frankly, I hope these websites continue to do this, because it just drives more and more people not only into the arms of my content, but into the arms of many pieces of content that are outside the mainstream that are frankly way more valuable. So
now, do you think that the prognosis is any better for the game development side of things?
The prognosis for game dev is uncertain, but I think it's for different reasons that we're not really talking about today. I don't think that the ideological issues in games in games dev really matters, because I think that there's more money involved. People have a little bit more fear, and they can be more easily replaced too, because while you're always looking for a desperate person to get into games journalism, it's just not as valuable as finding someone who can character model on a AAA level or whatever. So people make good money. They have security. They get bonuses and all of that. And I think the bigger problem with game dev and the security of game dev is just money. I think games are just becoming way too expensive to make. That the arms race is creating a situation where it's putting a lot of studios in peril, but that has nothing to do with the content of the games. It just has to do with expectations of how much games cost. Like Final Fantasy VII cost $40 million to make in 1997, which was considered a ridiculous amount of money to make a game, and you couldn't make anything for $40 million anymore. I think Control, the Remedy game, they said they made for something like 30 million euro, which must have been, which is like, when I read that, I'm like, that's incredible. How did you make this game for $30 million? That seems impossible when you have a game like The Last of Us Part 2 that was easily $150 million to make. So I think that's the bigger problem than the diverse layout of the studios, is just getting their financial house in order and convincing players that games need to be more expensive, which is a whole nother issue.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, before we close things up here, I want to ask a different question on a different random topic that's just selfish to me. I'm sure you don't remember, but when we left your apartment after recording, I asked you if I could ask you a game-oriented question, since we didn't get to talk about games at all, which this has been great, even though it's not been directly about nerding out over games. It's been fun to talk about games with you. But I'm a big fan of specifically the Castlevania games that I call Symphony-Like. So everybody talks about Metroidvanias, but there's a very specific subset of that genre that I call Symphony-Like that's not near as common. It's those Metroidvanias with XP grinding and loot grinding elements, those kinds of XP things you can lean on if your Twitch skills suck and you're not good at platformers, So I asked you, are we going to see a collection of those Symphony-Like Castlevania games come out on PS4? You said that you thought that we would. You seemed very confident in that. Now, a year later, I'm asking you to predict, give me a Colin was right moment. When? By when? Give me hope, Colin. When are we going to see this happen?
This is a great question, because I feel like you are going to see it happen. I just feel like it's more complicated, because while porting something like Circle of the Moon or Harmony of Dissonance or whatever would be more straightforward, Lament of Innocence, getting the DS games, so like, Order of Ecclesia and all of those on, would be a little more complicated because of the dual screen nature of it. But the reason I feel confident about it is because Konami has been pretty good about releasing these various collections recently. They released with Sony the Castlevania Requiem collection, which was Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night, which is obviously both one of our favorite games, Symphony. And also then they released like an arcade collection. They released a Contra collection. So I just feel like it's got to be in the cards. And by the way, Castlevania is huge on Netflix, the anime series. So we haven't had a new Castlevania game since 2014. That's when Lords of Shadow 2 came out. And I think that Mercury Steam's Lords of Shadow series is just an abortion. I just don't, I think the first game is, the 2010 Lords of Shadow is actually pretty good, but I think that they lost track of what makes these games great. So I think that there's a lot of room to bring the series back, and I would just be really shocked if Konami wasn't planning on doing that. I think a Castlevania collection, or a couple of them, or a few of them even, getting the trilogy from the NES, getting Super Castlevania in there, and Dracula X, and the Game Boy games and all of that would be really cool. So I wouldn't, and they did release a Castlevania collection with some of the old Castlevania games within as well.
Yes.
So I feel like that's just the next iteration, is to either make something really broad that includes everything, or just continue the Castlevania collection mantra that they did with the old school games, and that inevitably leads us to either the 3D Castlevania games, which are fine. I think Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness and those games are underrated, but it could also be moving us into the direction of the Metroidvanias, because those are really where people want to be with Castlevania, and I've always been really shocked that Konami hasn't given it more attention. It's really strange, actually. And so I think it's going to happen. I don't know when.
But when? Can you give? Can I get you to predict something?
Yeah, let's say 2021. I think that.
Okay.
If Konami looks at the experience of Capcom and what Capcom has done with their collections, specifically with Mega Man X, Mega Man ZX, and then also like the Disney games that they made in the NES era, They released a collection of Street Fighter games, etc. They re-released Darkstalkers and stuff, and they found a lot of success with most of that. Konami doesn't have to make new games. They can literally just iterate on this old stuff over and over again. And I know a lot of people are really focused on Silent Hill and all of that right now from their catalog, but Castlevania can come back. I think the canary in the coal mine, for better or for worse, I guess, maybe not the best reference, but is Castlevania on Netflix. Like, that is all based on Castlevania 2, Castlevania 3. They're going to do something. I mean, there's no reason for them not to take advantage of it. I think we might even get a new Castlevania game, but I just feel like people want these games. It reminds me a lot of Final Fantasy Tactics, where why aren't you just giving it to us again? I don't understand. And I think that a lot of it has to do with being shrewd and being like, we can really bring this out anytime. People are going to love it, and maybe we need it when we're most desperate. And I feel like Konami might be at its most desperate right now. So I just think that there are a lot of signs that they're willing to make their collections available. And let's say 2021, and we can revisit that and see if I was right.
All right. Oh, man, I hope so.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so where can people check out everything that you are doing?
Yeah, if you just go to colinslaststand.com, it'll link you out to everything. We do a weekly podcast for PlayStation called Sacred Symbols, and also a Patreon-exclusive episode of the show every week called Sacred Symbols Plus. I do a retro podcast, a nostalgia podcast with my brother called Knockback, and that's basically all the core products. So we're basically a podcast company. We do a little bit of video content. We're going to start bringing that back a little bit more. But colinslaststand.com will direct you to everything you need to see.
Nice. And I also want to congratulate you on the release of Twin Breaker a few months ago, and your now partial ownership of Lilymo Games, who made Twin Breaker, if I'm not mistaken. And I just earlier this week I'm not the audience for that kind of game, but I appreciated the things that you added to it as an olive branch to people who like theme and aren't into abstract games. And I just found myself bumming around on the couch with my wife this week, just to, I was like, hey, this is something I can do just to share some space with her for a little bit. And so anyway, yeah, nice work on that. What's kind of the next thing you guys are working toward?
Yeah, thank you. Twin Breaker's out, and we're porting the game to Switch and Xbox One and PC, so we'll have information on that soon. And then we're releasing the sequel to Lilymo's second game, which was called Harbroxia, which is an arcade space shooter. It's excellent. It's a really excellent game. That was the game that convinced me that I wanted to work with them. We're making the sequel to that will come out this fall, and then we're going to make a sequel to Twin Breaker that will come out in 2021. And then we're working on a much bigger game, a Japanese role, like a 16-bit JRPG style game. We're already contracting artists for it. I'm writing the story.
Sweet.
So that will be, we hope 2022, but we might need more time on that. So yeah, I bought 49% of the company, or CLS did technically, and it's awesome to be working with him. I've always wanted to be in game dev, and so to have creative control over games now and be the chief creative officer of a studio is wild, because now all of the story goes through me. Barry is such a wonderful and talented designer and programmer, so we have a really good thing going, and we contract out with artists and musicians. So I only expect good things from the studio, and it allows me to kind of grow and do other stuff, and that's what I'm excited about. I always wanted to make a game. Now I got to make a game. I put a game out into the wild. It's on PS4 and Vita. I got to read people's reviews and read all their complaints about my writing and stuff, and it's interesting to see the shoe is on the other foot, So not many of us have had that experience, so I can say that I have, and I'm glad that I did.
Nice. Well, thank you for being a voice promoting diversity of thought and diversity of expression in the games industry. I've appreciated that for years, and all the more now as you have a platform to really lean into that. And also really, really thank you for carving out some of your time to talk with me. I was surprised and thrilled when you accepted, and really appreciate your time and thoughtfulness.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad to do it, and we're glad to be back in the future. And I'm sorry that we've been trying to make this work for a while. I'm sorry that it took so long, but I'm happy to do it. You're a nice guy, and I find your perspectives very interesting. So,
thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Great. All right, well, that's all for now, guys. Thanks so much for watching and listening. Take care. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. We've got a ton going on here at Spirit Blade Productions and Christian Geek Central, including our in-depth Bible study for geeks, movie, game, and other entertainment reviews or commentary, live streams, Christian geek news, original audio dramas, and tons more. And on top of all that, you can become a Spirit Blade insider with an influential voice and get access to exclusive content and rewards. It's your involvement as a patron that will keep all of this going and growing. So I want to thank you you for your consideration in that. For more information, please check out our Patreon page through the link below at patreon.com/spiritbladeproductions. Thanks for listening.